Midday, so I shall begin this second art bite, as we're calling them, which are little sort of snapshots of different aspects of life and art in Florence. And today I'm going to talk about the city itself and the way in which the city has been used traditionally over time. I'll just see if I can remember how to dim the lights. Is that better? Now, this is an early map of Florence called the Pianta della Catena in Italian, which means the map of the chain, because its frame was a printed chain around the edges. And it's a very good way of getting a sense of what the city of Florence looked like in the 14th and 15th century. And you can tell by the slide that you have the old walled city here. So originally, Florence was contained within those walls. There are a number of major gates at each corner that allow people in and out of the city. But gradually, you see how the area known as Oltrarno, or other side of the river, has been developed. If you go online, you can find an animated version of this. They've actually sort of brought it to life, and it has music, and you can focus on the figures bathing in the river and people fishing and all the sort of everyday activity. But it's therefore, keep that in mind when you look at a map that I bought in Florence 20 years ago as part of a book about the city. And the old part of Florence really hasn't changed that much. The walls, to a great degree, no longer exist, although often when you walk through the city, you'll suddenly see a tall, narrow tower, which is, most of them have been turned into apartments, and that is a part of the old wall itself. So this is like the map, it's a bird's eye view, which allows you to see the different parts of the city. So if we start with arrow number 1, this is the Church of San Ferdinand, a very big church in Oltrarno. And when the Corsini family first started moving into Florence in the 14th century, they lived in the area around here. This is the Church of the Carmine, where the chapel of San Andrea Corsini is on the left as you go to the end of the nave towards the altar. Right up on the hills on the left you have the beautiful little town of Fiesole, which is where Andrea Corsini became the bishop in the 14th century, and he was the person who went on to become beatified and then canonized in 1629. So the family have their own saint, always useful, and that was the town where he spent a lot of his life. He was a very good man, and when he died, he left instructions that he was to be brought back into the city and buried in Oltrarno, where the family crypt was. At that time, the Church of Santo Spirito. But the locals loved him and didn't want to lose him, so they buried him in Fiesole. Well, the family weren't standing for that, so up they went, probably in the dead of night, and they uplifted his body and brought it back to the city. And there's a stream called the Munoni, which flows into the Arno, and they said it was a miracle that San Andrea created, so that the stream rose, and the people from Fiesole couldn't reach Florence. By the time they got down there, he was buried in the crypt, and that was that. Up on the other hill is the beautiful convent and church of San Miniato al Monte. It's a wonderful walk if you ever go there. You can either go up through the Boboli Gardens. Oops, I jumped on, sorry, wrong button. You can go up through the Boboli Gardens, through up here, and wind your way round. We can go along the river and up the stairs. It's a very beautiful walk, and you can go up there and listen to the. I'll just go back a few so I know which one we're looking at. So you can hear the vespers being sung on a Sunday evening, and it's absolutely enchanting. It's a very, very old church and well worth a visit. Bring my arrows back. We have the Duomo, which I'm sure all of you know about, Santa Maria del Fiore, which is in the sort of spiritual heart of Florence, with the baptistry in front of it and Giotto's tower to one side. The Signoria, which becomes the seat of government, and a Santa Croce, which is again a very old church and convent, and unfortunately, because it's low-lying beside the river, was especially damaged in the flood of 1966. And you have Palazzo Pitti, which becomes a very important palace bought by Onorata Toledo as wife of Cosimo the first Duke and then Grand Duke. She buys it, not him, but she helps to develop the Boboli Gardens, which is that area of green that you see here. Michelangelo designs the Belvedere, which actually is in a bastion formation, was used as a fortification. And the Florentines very sort of sarcastically said, well, I'm sure it's built up there so that they can fire their cannons at us, not at other invaders. Now, Piazza della Signoria, which I just mentioned, at the top you've got a bird's eye view, a sort of fish-eye lens. And it was fascinating when I found this view, because of course it's very like the view that you see in the exhibition, which is after Francesco Rosselli, which shows the execution of the Dominican friar Savonarola, who became the prior of the monastery, and he was a very charismatic preacher who persuaded a lot of Florentines that they should turn their sights away from the expansion of knowledge that had taken place, that incorporated looking at classical texts and artists painting things like the muses that you can see in the exhibition, which relate to the world of the classics. And he finally got above himself, and the Pope of the time, who was a Borgia and therefore not to be meddled with, tried him for heresy. And he and two of his fellow friars were tried publicly, and you can see that. They're kneeling in front of an altar here, then they're being led to execution. They were initially hung, and then their bodies were burnt, because the government at the time were terrified that people would collect bones and he would collect the relics, and that in death he would be just as powerful as he had been in life. Now, what is remarkable about this painting is it's a portrait of the city. And if you go to Florence today, if you look at the picture above, you can see that many of the architectural elements are quite identifiable. You can see San Miniato. Fiesole you can't see because it's hidden behind Brunelleschi's dome on the hill over here. But you've got the Loggia dei Lanzi, which you see up here, which at the end of the 15th century was used for public announcements. The major part of the city was illiterate. If you went to church, you had to be able to read a painting. Just as Maori can stand in the centre of a meeting house and read their whole whakapapa by the carvings, the tuku-tuku, the kowhaiwhai panels on the ceiling. So symbolism was an important part of literacy, but it was also felt that every public announcement must be easily accessible to everyone. So they would members of the Signoria would line up and make their proclamations here. You've got the Piazza della Signoria here with its very famous tower, and I mentioned the Duomo. This here is the campanile or bell tower of the Badia, and the Badia was an abbey, and before the Piazza, the Palazzo della Signoria was constructed, often people who'd been elected to government, because for a long time Florence was a commune and had an elected body, they would meet in the Badia. At one point, the monks did something to offend people, and the commune chopped their steeple down, and they had to build another one. But behind it, you have this crenellated tower, which is the tower attached to the building known as the Bargello. And in the 14th and 15th century, this was the prison, the major prison. There was another one with the unfortunately named called Listinque, which apparently was somewhere over here behind Santa Croce. And in the background, you've got this church, which you can see here, which has a plain brown stone front. And many of the churches in the 15th century had not yet received the marble facades that you see when you go to Florence today. But the other interesting thing about this painting is it's painted with what we call one-point perspective. If you see these lines that are laid out in the piazza, they are guides for the artist, and he spaces each of the activities that he's representing within those lines. So what he's actually doing is not unlike the photograph above. The buildings either side, here and here, have been opened up, whereas of course if you go to Florence and stand in the piazza in the position where that group of men are there in the foreground, you can see that the buildings are parallel. So he's opened it up using these lines created by this grid, the single perspective grid. And it's only later that artists come to realise that in fact we see multiple perspectives and our mind interprets them. You don't have to use a single perspective perspective as you've got here. On the side here, there's a little gap and there's a man walking through to alert you to the fact that it opens through there. And there's a church here, a very simple church, which of course ultimately gets demolished. And that wing of the Uffizi, which originally means offices, and then of course it becomes a gallery, is attached to the side of Palazzo della Signoria. So this is a painting, yes, about the judgment of a man who was deemed a heretic and who has overstepped the mark, but it is also a portrait of the city. And one of the fascinating things, if you research attitudes towards crime and the city in the 15th century, it was considered very important for the person who had been condemned to death to forgive the city before they die, and to do so publicly. Now, whether Fra Savonarola did or not, we don't know, but I have a feeling he probably didn't. And of course, the buildings that, the most obvious and building that stands out in Florence is Santa Maria del Fiore, which is the Duomo, known as the Duomo or the cathedral, and you can see Brunelleschi's magnificent dome above it. And in this image you can also see that same tower, the campanile of the Badia, and you can see the crenellated tower of the Bargello. Two other churches that were central to the Corsini family themselves. Originally I pointed out San Ferdinando, well that's it. It's a very large monastery complex just across the river, but more importantly is the Church of Santo Spirito, which for a long time was the family church until they moved their loyalties to the Church of the Carmine. But in the second part of the 15th century, the most important family in Florence were the Medici. And I've included three portraits here. First of all, Piero de Medici. He was born in 1416 and at one point was banished from the city. When he came back, and banishment was a common punishment if you disobeyed in some way, if you offended whichever ruling group of families were in charge at the time. And when he came back to Florence, he quickly established himself as a dynamic leader, but also he became a very important art collector. So he set that kind of precedent of building up major collections of art. His son, Piero the Gouty, or Il Gottoso, didn't live that long. Gout was a particularly cruel disease that was hard to treat. They didn't realise that eating mainly meat wasn't very good for them. But of course the figure that is perhaps most famous of all three is Lorenzo the Medici, who eventually earns the title Lorenzo the Magnificent. And 2 years before, he died in 1492, and when he died, Savonarola had been sitting by his side for a whole week or more, trying to persuade him to repent and to give up his love of the classical world. He always put it off till tomorrow, and then of course he died, so he escaped that. Now I'll just go back to Savonarola again, just to give you a little bit of detail about, first of all, about him. He actually was born in Milan, but I don't know how many of you have been to the church attached to the convent of San Marco. If you go into the cells there and you climb up the stairs, each of the cells around the upper level are very simple, but each of them is frescoed by an artist called Fra Angelico. And Fra just means brother, of course. And you can see an example of the cell that Fra Savonarola lived in until he became the prior. And then basically he got what amounted to a small apartment. But then I suppose if you're leaving the convent, that's perfectly fair. Now, as you can see in this, the painting of the Piazza, I want to talk now about some of the figures and how artists actually created works like this. You see how they're divided up into separate groups. You've got this man on horseback, which symbolises somebody coming in to witness the execution, but possibly signifying that he then goes out of Florence somewhere with the news that this has taken place. You get people discussing what's taking place. You also get, what fascinates me is this figure here. You see he's running in this direction. Look at that pose and look at this figure here. And then look at this tiny figure over here. Each of these is taken from the same cartoon. But because the figure is moving back in space, they're created smaller. And then what the, and it's probably an apprentice who does this, they get that sort of role. You turn the cartoon over and you draw him running in the opposite direction. So it's a lovely little indication of practice. You've got men here, servants, coming in with these large bundles of twigs called faggots on their backs to feed the fire. And in the exhibition itself, we have a tiny recipe book written in the 19th century by Antonietta Corsini. And one of her recipes is for pizza, and she says, wait until the faggots have burnt out. And just as you do with a pizza oven, you brush the ash to either side before you put the pizza in. So these faggots have been used, faggots of wood, and they were collected, of course, all over Europe and everywhere else. Piazzas were also, right the way up, are, right up to the present day, the scenes where people get together for pleasure. And I found these two wonderful images. There's a top work in a game of football in Piazza Santa Maria Novella in 1555. And football is a very popular sport in Florence. If you go there today, particularly on the Feast of San Giovanni, which is the 26th of June, they have the culture. It's now in the Piazza Santa Croce, and you can pay to go in, or you can just watch it on television, but stand to watch the procession. And I don't know whether it's true, but they said to me when I was living in Florence in 1992 that they used to let prisoners out of prison for the day in order to play football. The rules are incomprehensible. They basically seem to be the ball's over there, and it always traditionally was a sort of pigskin bladder that was blown up, and there'd be a mound of men fighting over here. You'd see these men with sort of cauliflower ears and broken noses. And if you look online, you can see photographs of them today. They look pretty ferocious. But they would be led before the football match. There would be a procession, and they would come from each of the quarters of Florence, wearing traditional costume, tossing the banners, playing traditional musical instruments. It's a wonderful thing to behold. But also, Santa Maria Novella was used for horse races, as we can see from this image below. And in this image, they're being ridden. But there was also a famous race where riderless horses would be obviously whipped at the beginning of the race, and they'd set off, and it was the one that got round the track first that won. What you also notice with this is how in the second painting of the horse race, the piazza seems to have been enlarged somewhat in order to contain all of the elements that you can see there. And of course it's from a different perspective. You've got the Church of Santa Maria Novella here, whereas there you've got it in the background. And this is much more accurate in relation to the space. But it's wonderful to get the side view here. Now let's return to the Medici. The Medici were driven out of Florence in the 1490s, and they didn't return to a position of authority until the second decade in the 16th century. And by that stage, there wasn't a direct relation left alive of Cosimo de Medici to rule the city. The French had taken over, and they allowed first Alessandro and then Cosimo I, who's the most famous. They appointed him Duke, and gradually afterwards he became Grand Duke of Tuscany. And he was a major figure in the city of Florence. Again, he was a great art collector, but also a collector, like Lorenzo the Magnificent, of rare books. There's a beautiful library. You go to the Church of San Lorenzo, you can go into the Laurentian Library, which has the most magnificent collection, where they now do exhibitions. And so he was a great promoter of art and architecture. And you can see the Pitti Palace in that top image, painted by Giusto Utens, who was a Flemish artist who came to Florence and was commissioned by the Medici to do portraits of their villas. And these were all meant to be hung together. And they, until recently, they were in a museum called the Museum of Florence as it was. That museum has been disbanded and the building taken over by the university now. So I'm not quite sure where they're on display now. But you can see, if you think about the map that I showed you earlier, how revolutionary this kind of bird's eye painting was. And it shows the beautiful garden that was developed by Eleanor da Toledo. There were, of course, additions made to this original building. You can see an older part of the building behind. And the front is that traditional rustication that you get in, you see in a lot of 15th century palazzi. But you can see how here there have been side wings added on and other buildings extended in here. And these bays that come out here, and going off to one side is what's known as the Vasari corridor, which runs all the way to the Uffizi. And the family didn't want to walk over the Ponte Vecchio, which it was famed for its butcher's shops and the smell. They wanted to be able to walk in privacy and, of course, safety from Piazza della Signoria, which instead of being lived in now was more a seat of, just a seat of government, back to their home on the other side of the river. But this is a wonderful old photograph because you're not allowed to park cars here now. This is all pedestrian. but it gives you, again, that very accurate view of the gardens behind. But also you can see how the trees may have been replanted, but they're enormous now. It's a wonderful place to visit. And this is a very famous portrait by Bronzino of Cosimo's wife, Eleonora da Toledo, and her son, Giovanni. She was a fascinating woman, Spanish from the court of Naples, because at the time Spain ruled Naples, and she was a woman of action herself. Even though she had many children, she didn't want to stay at home. She wanted to go into battle with her husband if that's what he was engaged in. And she became a very important figure. And often, as we know with rulers, there are interesting women in the background. When Cosimo first died, his son Francesco I was made Duke, and he married Giovanna of Austria. She had 8 children, only 2 of whom survived, and it was a very unhappy marriage. She didn't speak much Tuscan or Italian. She wanted to speak her native language, and she wanted to go home. And one can understand why she wasn't very happy, because for most of the marriage, Francesco was having an affair with Bianca Capello, who was considered infamous in Florence, but partly that was because she was Venetian. Before Giovanna died, she lived in this house here, which is covered in Via Maggio, the same street that a lot of the Corsini moved into when they first came to Florence. And she lived in this amazing house, which the whole facade of which is covered with a particular kind of design called sgraffito. It's actually where the term graffiti comes from. But these are very beautiful designs. And of course, what really upset the Florentines is she gave birth to a son, Antonio. And when Giovanna died, the Florentines were terrified that Francesco would not only legitimize his son, but also appoint him his heir. Now, one of the places so they married, Bianca and Francesco married, and they spent a lot of time initially at the beautiful villa at Pratolino, which is a bus ride outside of Florence. You can see the design here in the portrait by Utens. And this garden was famous for its use of hydraulics. It also has this remarkable sculpture by Gian Bologna of the figure of the Apennines. And if you go to the gardens today, that is the only sculpture still remaining. In the 19th century, the garden was transformed into a sort of capability brown garden. So if you go in the spring, it has beautiful meadows full of wildflowers. But there's none of the sense of the structural garden that you can see behind. And we have prints in Robertson 1 in the exhibition. We have a print done of part of the garden, and it was full of what you call water jokes. Behind the figure of the Apennines, when I went there, they had an exhibition of this. There was a figure of a dragon, and it was it was made to move by buckets filling with water, and as they got heavier, they dropped. And as they dropped, 2 wings on the dragon rose up in the air and then came down again. And unfortunately, all we have is a model of that now. But if you walked through the various winding lanes, water could spout over your head suddenly to give you a fright. And if you sat on the stone benches, spurts of water could come up underneath you. I suppose on a hot day, anything to keep cool. But of course, that notion of going on a journey in a garden, often the classical sculptures were used as a sort of trail, and people who were educated could walk through the gardens and talk about the different references to the world of the classics. Another important palazzo, or villa in this case, that belonged to the Medici is Poggio Arcaiano, and you can still visit that today. Again, you can see what it looked like early on when Giusto Utens painted it. It had straight stairs coming down, quite steep, into the garden, whereas now it has this very beautiful set of curved stairs. There's a vast orangery that goes off to one side, but it's also famous for its interiors. Both Pontormo and Allori, two artists represented in the exhibition, worked on the frescoes at Poggio al Caiano, and here you can see the main salon and a detail of the frescoes on the wall. And this was the villa, where both Ferdinand and Bianca died within a matter of hours of each other. At the time, it was thought that they had died of malaria. They were exhumed. All of the Medici bodies were exhumed in the 20th century, and twice actually, and various scientific tests were carried out on them. And both skeletons, and particularly the remains that were found, that they think that the entrails, that, like the Egyptians, they took the entrails out when they autopsied them and buried them separately. They were shown to have high quantities of arsenic. But arsenic was also used in medicine, and Francesco I was an alchemist. He was sort of proto-scientist, if you like, and a lot of the experiments that he carried out involved the use of arsenic. So they cannot prove conclusively one way or another, but there's no doubt that the Florentines celebrated the day that poor Bianca Capella departed the scene. Now, Ferdinand, Francesco's brother, was there at the time, and he had actually sent letters back to the Pope in Rome saying, well, they're not very well, but they're going to be absolutely fine. And he was a cardinal in the church. When his brother died, he relinquished his role, and he proclaimed himself the heir to Francesco, because, of course, the only other child was Antonio, who had been legitimised, but Francesco hadn't nominated him as his heir. So Ferdinand declared himself Grand Duke of Tuscany, and he took as his wife Christina of Lorraine in 1589. And the celebrations that were held in Florence at the time were absolutely magnificent. Every time one of the dukes married, there would be river festivals, there would be wonderful floats, there'd be horse parades, there'd be fireworks, there'd be all kinds of activities. But I think Ferdinand probably had the most elaborate celebration because he had what was called a naumachia. They actually flooded the courtyard of Palazzo Pitti, and they made boats and they had a sea battle. So it was absolutely spectacular, and this was done by, the print was done by Orazio Scarabelli, no doubt elaborated on one way and another. But the other fascinating thing is that it shows the courtyard actually covered over, glassed over. This shows the restoration of the dome of Santa Maria del Fiore, which is one of the prints that we have in our room in Robertson 1. Now, Ferdinand did a lot of restoration in Florence, but as far as records tell, he didn't actually restore the dome. It may have been a project that he was involved in, but it never actually came to pass. But it's a wonderful work because it shows you how important this idea was, that you would bring your project to the Duke, you would present it to him, whether it was for a painting, whether it was for a new building, whether it was for a restoration, and everything had to be approved. Now, when Ferdinand died, his son Cosimo was appointed Cosimo II, but he was a child still, and so his mother and grandmother both ruled Florence as his regents. And at the time, another Flemish artist, Justus Sustermans, he's known by both, worked within the court, and he worked there for 2 generations and created numerous portraits of the Grand Dukes. And we have in the exhibition the oval portrait. You can see another work on the left, which is a detail of another painting. And of course, any family like the Corsini who were loyal to the Medici would have portraits of all the important members of the family within their palazzi. Now, Cosimo II, when he reaches adulthood, marries Archduchess Maria Magdalena of Austria, who again is a German-speaking rather than Italian. He doesn't rule for that long. He dies of tuberculosis in 1621. But he had a very interesting education. He was a patron of Galileo, who'd been his tutor, and he was much more interested in the real business of science and also development. And so he changed the focus of academic learning at the time. He's shown in this other portrait, which is also in the Corsini Collection, and I wish we could have got it for the exhibition, but it was too large. And he's shown in this work standing in a pose that has been used by both his father and his grandfather and his great-grandfather. And he has his hand in this work balanced on the top of a very elaborate visor. This had been gifted by France to Florence, and it became seen as a kind of motif of their right to rule. And it's now in the Metropolitan Museum in New York. Sorry, wrong button. Now, his son, Ferdinand II, becomes Grand Duke, and again, he has to be nurtured until he's old enough to rule. And we have the oval portrait in the centre. You can see him in the same pose as that portrait by his father. But what is interesting here is he holds a compass. And he was important for developing the port of Livorno. He was, like his father, very interested in developing trade links, further trade links with the East. But because he was interested in what happens to the body, when he contracted smallpox, he allowed Sutherlands to actually portray him twice. In this image on the left, you can see his face entirely covered with blisters and his eyes closed. And so it becomes a very important sort of medical document. And finally, we have this print, which is also in our own collection, which shows Maria Magdalena leading what was called the Procession of the Dowries. Now, this festival took place every 2 or 3 years, and young women, in this case 141 young women in Florence, went to the church of San Lorenzo, which was the Medici family church, and it has the library itself that I mentioned to you is in this wing here, around the cloisters, above the cloisters. And the procession of the dowry involved each of the girls, after they'd attended Mass, being given a small bag of money, and you won't see it in this reproduction probably, but a number of them have a little cloth bag. That's their dowry, and a dowry could be used to either enter a convent. You didn't need as much money if you entered a convent, or to take a husband. And the leading women from the families, and it would have included the Corsini family, then led the girls on a procession. They went past the Duomo, the cathedral, and they made their way past various buildings that the Medici family, had either restored or rebuilt or had some sort of intervention. And they ended in Piazza Santa Maria Novella, where we saw the horse race and the football. And that was because the Duke Ferdinand had sponsored the changing of a convent, San Paolo, into a hospital for people who had operations or whatever in one of the major hospitals. And this was simply for recuperation. And so they really marked all of the important interventions that Ferdinand de Medici had made upon the city. But at the same time, of course, it was very important because it gave women freedom to leave their homes and get married. Otherwise, there's lots of wonderful little paintings from earlier in the 15th century. If you look at the predillas that are underneath the main religious painting, often you see a miracle where a saint is lobbing little bags of money through a window into the house of a man too poor to marry off his daughter. So, it was a very important part of everyday life in Florence. So I'll stop there, because otherwise I'll go too far. But does anyone have any questions? No? Then you can go and look at the exhibition. Thank you for coming.